All right, Isaiah 45. Let's call this one Purpose and subtitle it Cyrus. Understanding that this chapter seems to describe Cyrus, a king who seems to prosper by remaining focused on the purpose that God gives him, much like we saw God's anointed or his servant, seeming to refer to the Christ and the way in which he was going to prosper by remaining focused on the purpose that God gave him. Cyrus is going to give us another example of that in this chapter that I want to summarize, not so much sequentially, but maybe according to the roles that its different characters or people have fallen into. First and foremost, of course, that being Cyrus, understanding that the first chapter is going to, in my summary or my way of thinking, the first verse is going to seem to describe his mission to subdue nations before him, to loose the belts of kings, and to open doors before him. God promising to help him accomplish this by, in verse 2, going before him to level the exalted places, to break into pieces the doors of bronze, and to cut through the bars of iron. As in verse 3, he is going to begin to talk about Cyrus's purpose. First, in verse 3, he's going to say, so that you may know, because the chapter is going to identify Cyrus as someone who does not otherwise know God. But beyond making the introduction, he is going to go more in depth into Cyrus's purpose by, in verse 4, saying, it is for the sake of his servant Jacob, which is going to be super important for Cyrus to remember, because the kingdom he is about to replace, Babylon, forgot that and became distracted by things that proved to be inconsistent for the purpose that he had for them with relationship to Israel, or with relation to Israel, as God is going to go on and offer Cyrus additional help in the way of counsel in verses 5 through 7, helping him to understand that you are free to look into the concept of other gods, but don't take too long, because you have something to accomplish. And he is going to say that God is the only one. Understanding that, he is going to go on in verse 8 to talk about the way in which God has a methodology by which he does things over and over. In much the same way he described his servant David, God accomplishes things in righteousness, thus seeming to give Cyrus a red or a green flag for the things that are consistent with the way in which God is calling him to go about the things that he is designed or he is purposed for him to do. Verse 13, going on to give us more information about that purpose, once again saying, I have stirred him up in righteousness, not for the price or for the reward or the gain that he can get in all of the conquest that God is going to basically open up before him. And in verse 14, he's going to go on to talk about the way in which he is going to equip Cyrus. Most of the times I think of equipment as stuff, but he is going to equip Cyrus with peoples, some of the mightiest nations, or nations that had been the mightiest of their time, among them Egypt and Cush, the Sabaeans likewise. I don't necessarily know who the Sabaeans are, but the chapter is going to describe them as men of stature, specifically in verse 14. Understanding that the work that God has for Cyrus to accomplish on behalf of Israel is not just for Israel. So the chapter is going to conclude roughly around verse 22, going on to the end of the chapter in verse 25, by saying, turn to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth. Going back to some things we saw in the Psalms and then early on here in Isaiah, where God seems to remind Israel of their role in his larger purpose for the entire world. In this chapter, twice more reminding them that righteousness plays a role in his restoration. Once in verse 23 and again in verse 24 before he concludes the chapter. Understanding that I mentioned there is another perspective, God is going to go on to talk about the ways in which those who have gone before Cyrus have departed or left their purpose and become distracted. First in verses 9 through roughly 12, in the way in which they have bickered with God as to why and quite possibly how he is going about accomplishing his purposes. Not content with that, though, round about verse 16, they're going to seem to fall into the trap that God cautioned Cyrus away from, and that is wasting time trying to look for alternatives to God when he is the only one. And not content to simply search for alternatives to God. Verses 20 and 21 are going to seem to describe the way in which they are going to invest in faulty alternatives to God. This chapter giving us yet another perspective on idolatry, this time moving beyond merely calling out its folly to giving us yet another example of an individual who was able to succeed by remaining committed to their purpose. Not just any purpose, but the one for which God quite possibly created them.